There's a lot of opportunity for men to, become very accomplished in their careers or to become very accomplished in other areas of their life and feel that they've overcome senses of inadequacy through that. Women can become very accomplished in their careers. Women can do so much in their lives, but if they're single or they haven't been chosen by a romantic partner, that sense of inadequacy seems to linger. Welcome to the Conscious Love Show. My name is Shane Kohler. I've spent over a decade helping women understand the unconscious patterns driving their relationships and what it actually takes to change them. I'm one of the most direct voices in the modern relationship space and the person who will tell you the truth that most coaches are afraid to name. This show is for anyone who's done settling, done shrinking, and done wondering why love keeps falling short. I'm not here to make you feel better about patterns that aren't serving you. I'm here to name them, help you understand them, and learn how to change them. If you're ready for that, I'm glad you're here, and let's get into it. Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Conscious Love Show podcast. Shane Kohler here. As always, it is a pleasure to be on with you today. Today, we are talking about releasing the need to be chosen and learning to choose conscious love. I think men and women alike can definitely relate to this conversation and this need to be chosen, but I do think especially this is a particularly powerful wound for the feminine. And I think for so many women out there, this wound of needing to be chosen shapes so much of their relationships with men. There's a lot of opportunity for men to, become very accomplished in their careers or to become very accomplished in other areas of their life and feel that they've overcome senses of inadequacy through that. Women can become very accomplished in their careers. Women can do so much in their lives, but if they're single or they haven't been chosen by a romantic partner, that sense of inadequacy seems to linger. And so in today's conversation, I want to really focus on how do we release that need to be chosen? How do we release that need to be chosen and step into the position of being the chooser? Step into the position of choosing conscious love. I mentioned a couple of things about, a rejection wound or an abandonment wound or an inadequacy wound or a conditional love wound or a neglect wound or a betrayal wound or over responsibility wounds, right? There are all these different kinds of things that no matter where you came from, right? No matter what your life was like, I don't think any of us make it through childhood unwounded. And whether we get it from our parents, and many of us, even if we had really loving and supportive parents, and I know a lot of us did, I also know a lot of us didn't, right? And so you can kind of plug yourself into wherever you fit here. But even when we came from the best of circumstances, we grew up in a world that had a lot of pressure, right? We grew up in a world that had a lot of expectation. Even parents who loved us and wanted the best for us usually had a certain idea of who we were supposed to be and tried to fit us into this idea of who we were supposed to be. And, I mentioned a conditional love wound. And I think this is something that is so universal in our world, is we are treated as children with conditional love. And the impression, the identity that we develop as children when we are treated with conditional love is that there are conditions on who I can be. And what I mean by that is that it's okay for me to express certain aspects of myself, and it's not okay for me to express other aspects of myself. Just a really obvious example that's coming to mind right now is and I don't know how much of the listenership this is real for, but if you were gay, right? If you were gay and you grew up in our normal kind of patriarchal society here, like there is a huge incentive for people to not express that parts of themselves. And I've coached women whose husbands have left them after 20 years of marriage to go, lean into their double life, which was like, being gay or trans or something like that. And I'm not criticizing that lifestyle, but what I'm pointing out here is how this person went to such extreme lengths not to be themselves, right? To where they got into a straight marriage, they were married for 20 years, they had to live this double life in secret, and then eventually they have to come out because they just can't live with the dichotomy anymore. They just can't live with the inauthenticity anymore. And then, it causes an incredible amount of suffering to their wife, to their children, obviously to themselves as well. And it would have been so much easier if they could have just been that from the beginning, right? It would have been so much easier if somebody had just fostered in them that permission to be that full version of themselves. And I know that's, maybe a minority example, right? That's not what the majority of people are going through. But I think we all have that part of us. We all have that part of us that hasn't been given permission to exist. We all have that part of us that hasn't been given permission to explore. And for some of us, that shows up in our sexuality, right? Some of us don't explore our sexuality because, and I'm not just talking about alternate versions of sexuality, even in a heterosexual situation, we don't fully explore our sexuality. Some of us don't fully explore our passions. Some of us don't fully explore our, the greatest role that we could take in a career world, or in so many different ways, right? Like we don't really go all the way with things in our life because we've developed certain ideas about what is acceptable and what is not. And a lot of us, even well into adulthood, are still living within parameters of what we think people are going to find acceptable. And that's a conditional love wound, right? That is something that started very early on in our lives when our parents and our teachers and our classmates and all the world around us started to tell us that certain things are okay, certain things are acceptable, and other certain things are not okay, and other certain things are not acceptable. And what's really insane about this is that as we get older, even though it becomes irrelevant at a certain point, like it gets to a certain point where no matter what you do, you're going to disappoint someone, right? If you don't disappoint your parents, you're going to disappoint your friends. And if you don't disappoint your friends, you're going to disappoint your boss. And if no matter what you do, someone is going to be disappointed. And so it gets to a point where all of these impressions that we've learned early on in our lives become incredibly irrelevant. But by that time, we're so programmed into a certain idea of who we're supposed to be that we don't give ourselves permission to explore outside of that. And this plays in directly to the need to be chosen. You see, at a very young age, it starts out with, I need to be chosen by my parents. And so I play into that conditional love, right? Who do they want me to be? What do I need to do? And this is a survival response, right? That we learn at a very, very young age. We learn that, wow, when my parents are happy with me, it feels good. And when they're not happy with me, it feels bad. Right? And this is something that starts for us at such a young age. And we learn as a survival adaptation. It's a way that we adapt our personalities and we adapt our identity for acceptance, for love, for validation. And a lot of us had parents who could never be impressed. A lot of us, or teachers or other people, were trying to fit in with the kids at school, right? But a lot of us were in situations that were completely impossible. No matter what we did, we couldn't impress people, but we keep trying and we keep trying and we keep trying and we keep trying. And what I want to presence here in this conversation is that it's not a mistake we made. Like maybe as adults, we could say it's a mistake we continue to make. But this isn't a mistake we made. Like, as a child, this was something we had to do to survive. You know, if a child had very aware, conscious, loving, and supportive parents, maybe they had a parent who would sit down and have this conversation with them and say to them, like, listen, it's okay to be you. You don't have to play into what other people want you to be. But a lot of parents don't even teach their children that, right? A lot of parents are like, look, people are watching you, and you can't disappoint the neighbors, and you've got to show up for your teachers, and you've got to be a great student. And often those are in the best of circumstances, right? Those are when the parents are not addicted and the parents are, you know, stable and like you have a stable home environment and a roof over your head, and you get that kind of pressure in those environments. And in an unstable household, maybe where there was divorce or where the family was falling apart or where the parents had addictions or where there were financial issues to where you could barely make ends meet, that's a whole other level of insecurity. And as children, we don't have the intelligence or the awareness. I shouldn't call it intelligence because children are highly intelligent. Probably fundamentally, a lot of children are more intelligent than a lot of adults. But we don't have the awareness. We don't have the discernment because we haven't learned that. We haven't been taught that. And so we don't have the ability to kind of distinguish what's right or what's wrong. We don't have the ability to distinguish what's healthy or what's unhealthy. We just have to do what we've got to do to survive our childhood. And so we adapt to our environment to get our needs met. And this begins the cycle of needing to be chosen. Now, some of us had abandonment wounds, right? Like if I think about my father, who he wasn't there when I was born. I met him once when I was 5 years old. It was like, I remember when my father came to visit me when I was 5 years old, it was like the best week of my life. I mean, I was the happiest kid that you had ever met. I finally had my dad. For 5 years, I had wanted my dad. I knew he existed. You know, like I think about, like, it's so interesting to think, like, I didn't know this person. I knew that he existed. I knew that I had a dad somewhere, but I had never met him. I didn't know anything about him. But I'll never forget how deeply I was impacted when I finally met my dad. And he was there for a week, and I was the happiest kid in the world for that week. And, you know, just to think about how fundamentally this need to be wanted by my dad was there. And I don't even really know where that comes from. It's not a conscious thing. It's an evolutionary thing. It's something that, like, I didn't choose that. I was born with that. And we're all born with that, right? This need to be loved by our parents. We're all born with that. And I guess we're born with it because we need that to survive. So maybe there's something in our bodies and in our physiology that programs us to seek that, because if we don't have that, we won't survive. But I remember it's such a weird phenomenon to think that I didn't even know this person, but I was so happy that he loved me, or that he seemed to love me for that week that he showed up in my life. And so some of us have these kinds of abandonment wounds where I remember my entire childhood, as much as, you know, I never had a therapist talk to me about this. My mom never even really talked to me about it. She would tell me things about my dad sometimes, but she never really talked to me about how his absence was impacting me. And when I was 13, I ended up going to live with him, and I ended up realizing why it was actually good that he wasn't in my life, because he was an alcoholic and a drug addict and a narcissist and all this stuff. But I remember for the first 13 years of my life, I would talk to him on the phone sometimes. He would occasionally send me a gift in the mail or something like that. And I remember, even though nobody ever talked to me about it, I never talked about it, I never even voiced it, there was this suspicion inside of me that I wasn't worthy, that I wasn't enough for him to love me. And I remember he would always say, you can come visit me anytime. I'll buy you a plane ticket. Just tell your mom to put you on the plane. And my mom wouldn't let me go, and I resented her for it at the time. But when I look back, sending me to this guy in Florida who was, who he was, probably wasn't a good idea. So I can understand why she was a little hesitant to let me go visit him by myself. But she always said, he can come visit you anytime. And I always wondered, why doesn't he want to come visit me? Why am I not enough for my dad to come visit me? Right? And that's an abandonment wound. That's there's a fundamental need in each of us to be loved by our parents. And when we're not receiving that love that we need, we experience an abandonment wound. And that can be due to the kind of situation where your parent just doesn't show up. That can be due to divorce, to death. It can even be due to a parent who is physically there but emotionally absent. And I think this is where maybe the track of a young man and a young woman differs. Because as a young man, what the world taught me is I need to be stronger than that. I need to overcome that. I need to not let it get to me. I need to be tough. I need to be strong. I need to shut down my emotions. And that leads to the kind of emotional unavailability that so many men have in our world. So many women, when they're in relationship with men, they just crave for their men to be more emotionally unavailable. Well, this is the kind of teaching that young boys like me get that prevents that emotional availability. Right? Because if I were to sit around and cry about my dad not loving me or not showing up for me, that would have made me less of a man in my society. And I need to be accepted by my society. I need to be accepted by my peer group. Whereas for a young woman, we almost kind of encourage that kind of neediness in our societies. Right? It's acceptable for women to feel that way. And we see it in the movies. We see it in the music, right? Like the heartbreak songs of women pining over their men. The movies, the women who, are heartbroken over their men. And, you don't see these images, or it's not as openly invited for men to be that way. And I think the emotional experience is like, look, we're all human, right? The emotional experiences are the same for both of us, but how we are encouraged to adapt to that is very different. So for a young man, it's like, okay, well, your father's not there. You have this abandonment wound. Buck up and be a man and get over it and be strong and be stoic and be independent and be isolated. And I think the message that young women get, and this is where it becomes really, really insidious. This is why I say it's such a core feminine wound, is because the message that young women get unconsciously, I don't think anybody ever sits down and tells them this word for word, but they say, go find a man to love you, and that'll make up for it. Whereas men, it's almost, you don't need anybody to love you. You'll be fine on your own 2 feet. With women, it's go find somebody to love you, and that'll fix it. And so I think we get started on kind of 2 different tracks here. Now, we all have the same want to be chosen. We all have that same want, but we adapt to it differently. And for women, so many times it becomes a need to have someone pick me. And for men, it often becomes the denial of that need. I don't need anyone. I don't need anything. I'm good on my own. And then how this adapts as adults, when, we get 20, 30 years down the road, is you have women who have this desperate need to be picked by somebody. And you have these men who have been trained to think they don't need anything. And now you have our modern dating culture. And I know I'm speaking very, very much in generalities right now, right? So I've got to, in order to express these ideas, I have to make them general. But of course, there are men who feel the way that I'm describing women to feel right now. There are women who feel the way that I'm describing men to feel right now. There are women who have felt that desperation to be picked and have felt weakened by that and have become resentful about that. And so they have shifted all the way over to ultra independence. I don't need anything. I don't need anyone. They've taken on a more masculine wound because maybe to them that feels safer than the feminine wound. And I'm not saying that any of this is good or bad or right or wrong. What I'm saying is all of it is an adaptation to our wounding. All of it is a survival response, and the longer that we live in survival, we are not able to thrive in our lives. Right? Does everybody get that? As long as you are trying to survive, you are not able to thrive. And so I want to really focus in on this need to be chosen. And whether it stems from an abandonment wound, whether it stems from a conditional love wound, whether it stems from a rejection wound or an inadequacy wound, or any of these different types of core wounds that we develop early on in our lives. This is why it becomes so insidious and why it becomes so difficult. As I said earlier, a healthy want to be chosen leads me to choose partners that will choose me in return. Right? A healthy want to be chosen leads me to choose partners who are going to choose me in return. But a need to be chosen, a need to be picked, right? Like pick me. That causes us to choose people who will not choose us. Now, I know that might seem a little counterintuitive. Like, if I need to be chosen, why would I choose people who don't choose me? So I want to really break down the psychological dynamic that's happening here. When I need to be chosen, I want you to understand what's happening for someone when they need to be chosen. And again, as I said, this tends to be more of a feminine wound, but if it's happening for a man, it's just as relevant. When I need to be chosen, what I'm doing psychologically is I am operating from that wound that happened early on in my life. And essentially what I'm wanting is a do-over, right? I'm wanting a second chance to fix that original problem where it happened. So if my father left when I was young, or if I was constantly rejected by a parent, or if I was constantly, invalidated or devalued by a parent, or maybe even by the kids at school, or by teachers, or by my first handful of relationships, right? The wounds can come from all these different places. But what I want unconsciously when I need to be chosen, what is kind of driving the bus, so to speak, when I need to be chosen, is I want a do-over on this original wound. I want a second chance on this original wound. And what I say to myself, again, and I want to be clear, when I say what I say to myself, it's what I unconsciously say to myself. Nobody thinks this. Nobody thinks this is what they're doing. But unconsciously, what I say to myself is if I can get this person to love me, then I'll be enough. Now, there are a couple of problems with this. First of all, as long as that need is active, Nobody can ever give you enough. No matter how attentive they are, no matter how in tune they are, no matter how compassionate or understanding they are, no matter how deeply they try to meet your needs, you may be momentarily satisfied. But it's always going to fall flat because nothing they are doing is changing the internal condition. Right? If there's a feeling of inadequacy inside, if there's a feeling of unworthiness inside, if there's a feeling of I am not enough, then what's happening is no matter what somebody does, no matter how attentive they are, no matter how much they try to meet your needs, you might be momentarily satisfied by certain things they do or certain things they say, but eventually what is always reflected back to you is that feeling of inadequacy. That's not something that can be healed from the outside. You know, if you think about it like this, if there's a bottomless pit of inadequacy in your soul, not like a reality or truth of who you are, but like an experience you're having, right? People can pour and pour and pour into that bottomless pit. I love you. You're amazing. You're amazing. Let me take you out. Let me pay for dinner. Let me buy you gifts. Let me shower you with praise. Let me make love to you. Let me. And you feel momentarily satisfied when you're receiving these things, but they're going into a bottomless pit. So the wound cannot be healed from the outside. There is nothing that someone can pour into you that will heal the wound. That's the first thing. But now, this might be even the more difficult part of it, is that not only can somebody not fix the wound from the outside, but I end up choosing relationships with people who won't even try. I end up choosing relationships with people who won't even make the effort to validate me, who won't even make the effort to meet my needs. And here's why I do that. It is because I'm operating from a wounded past. And so I am attuned to the woundedness in others. I am tuning in to subtle cues I pick up in people that reflect the original wounds that took place. Because remember what I said earlier. What I'm trying to get is a do-over. What I'm trying to get is a second chance to heal the wound at the source. So it's not like, well, I'm going to go find a healthy partner and be validated by them. It's like, no, I need to go back to where the wound happened. I needed to go back to the same kind of energetic quality where the wound originally took place. I need to find the same kind of energy that originally hurt me. And I need to try to fix it there. This is why so many people, and I know it's like the whole attraction to the bad boy, right? People always say, why do women like bad boys? Well, it's not that women like bad boys. That's not even true. But what it is that when we are operating from a woundedness, we need to try to correct that wounded energy where it originally happened. If a healthy, secure, conscious partner who's totally safe and totally loving and totally supportive loves you and validates you, that doesn't count. This is why so many people say, I'm not attracted to that healthy, secure, safe person. Because it doesn't count if it comes from them. Of course they would love me. How predictable. Of course they would be stable. Of course they would be consistent. It doesn't count coming from them because that's not fixing the problem. That's not healing the original wound where it originally happened. What I need to do is I need to find that bad boy and I need to make him love me. I need to find that same energy that hurt me in the first place, and I need to transform that energy into something that is going to offer me safety and security and wholeness. Which is basically an impossible task. But even if you did pull off the impossible, even if you found that bad boy and turned him into a good boy, well, then you wouldn't like him because he would no longer have that energetic quality. And so this is the impossible situation that we put ourselves in when we're operating from that wound. And so how do we resolve this? That's the question I want to address here. How do we resolve this? And the clearest answer I've found to how we resolve this comes through the work we do around inner child healing. What inner child healing really is it's where we learn a process of reparenting, right? We learn how to reparent the wounded parts of ourselves, which are always children. And maybe they're 3 years old. Maybe they're 7 years old. Maybe they're 10 years old. Maybe they're 13. Maybe they're even 21 in some cases. That's a little bit old. Maybe they're 15 or 17. But they're these younger parts of ourselves. They're these younger parts of ourselves where we have experienced a pain. You know, I think of like, I've shared about this many times on the podcast, but like my first real heartbreak was when I was 16, and it was devastating for me. And the circumstances weren't devastating. I mean, it was a 16-year-old girl and a 16-year-old boy. We dated for less than a year. We were in love, as in love as you can be at that age. But you see, what happened for me at that time was I had become truly vulnerable for the first time in my life. I had opened my heart to someone for the first time in my life, and I was naive enough to think that that would last forever. And so here's this kind of perfect storm of, you know, I have this childhood where my dad wasn't around and my mom was her own version of helplessness, toxicity, and there was all this wounding that I was carrying. And I found this 16-year-old girl who, you know, seemed to love me, and I seemed to love her, again, as much as we could, at being as young and naive as we were. And I put my whole faith in her. And I thought that she could heal this inadequacy that I had carried with me throughout my whole life. And when she left me, I mean, I felt so deprived. I felt so empty. And the way she did it, and I'm not judging her. I mean, she was 16. We all make mistakes, right? But like, she cheated on me, and then she, with a mutual friend of ours, and then she kind of like threw it back in my face. And it was just the most gut-wrenching thing I'd ever experienced. And so when we put our faith in someone and we experience that betrayal, that's another kind of wound. And so if I look back at my past, if I were to look at my inner child wounding, I might have a wound at 5 years old when my dad came to visit and then he left and never came back. Right? I have a series of wounds that I went through with my mom, who was overbearing and controlling and invalidating. I have a wound that happened when I was 13, and I left my mom to go live with my dad. And I mean, I could probably count on both hands the times I've seen my mom since that day. Right? And my mom, I mean, she wasn't perfect, but she was my world. And in an instant, she was gone. And I might have a wound at 16 when my ex-girlfriend broke up with me. right? What I was just sharing about. And I'm just naming some of these like core pivotal moments in my life that these are versions of myself that have kind of been locked in time. Right? It's interesting. The positive experiences don't lock us in time because they open us up. Right? Those moments where we get love, the moments where we get recognition, the moments where we get appreciation, the moments where we get validation, the moments that we have joy. Those moments don't lock us in time because those moments actually set us free. They make us feel safe. They validate our wholeness. So those moments don't get locked in time, but there are moments in our lives where we are wounded in certain ways. And these become constraints on our wholeness. They become constraints on our authenticity. And so again, maybe I have one at 5 years old, and I have some throughout my life, when I was growing up with my mother, and I have the wound from when I left my mother, and I have the wound from when my ex-girlfriend broke up with me when I was 16, and I have these wounds from the abuse I experienced with my father, and I have all these wounds throughout my adolescence and my childhood. And these are parts of myself that have been shut down and locked in time. And what each of these parts are saying, if I go back to the 5-year-old part of me, that my dad, he came to visit and then he never came back. And there's a part of me that says, I need to know that I'm enough for my father. Right? I need to know that I'm loved by my father. If I look at all the years that I was growing up with my mother, who was overbearing and controlling and invalidating, right? And I've shared a little bit about this, but my mom was extremely religious and everything I did was wrong. Every television show I wanted to watch, it wasn't holy enough for her. Everything I was into, every song I wanted to listen to, on and on, right? Everything about me was wrong, was sinful to her. And so there's a part of me, if I look back at my childhood, there are these wounded parts of myself that says, I need to be enough for my mom. I need to be good enough for my mom. Right? If I look at my breakup when I was 16, right? There's this vulnerable teenage part of myself that says I need to be able to trust and not be betrayed in that trust. If I look at the abuse that I experienced with my father, and my father was like a tyrannical, alcoholic psychopath sometimes. I need to feel safe in my home. I need to feel safe to be myself and not feel like I'm walking on eggshells and not feel like I'm going to be criticized for everything I say or everything I do. Not feel like he could fly off the handle about some random thing at any moment, right? And so I'm illustrating this because I want to give some examples of these different types of wounding that I've experienced and that I think we've all in different forms, and your experience is probably different than mine. But there are these parts of ourselves that get locked in time. And what these parts of ourselves are saying is essentially, I have a need that hasn't been met. The need for safety, the need for validation, the need to be able to trust, the need to be enough for my environment, for my family, for the people around me. And when these unmet childhood needs are informing our decisions, informing our identity, informing the way we think about ourselves, and informing the way that we relate with others. When these unmet childhood needs are constantly informing our day-to-day life, we end up trying to get these needs met in all the wrong places. And I've given examples of that already. In the partners we choose, in this bottomless pit of love and attention and validation that never seems to get filled. And so what we need to do as conscious, responsible adults is we need to learn to recognize those needs when they are active within us, to recognize those wounds when they are active within us, and to learn to meet them by ourselves. Now, this doesn't supersede our basic human needs for love and connection. See, I'm not saying that, oh, you're never going to need anyone. No, we need each other on this planet. If we didn't need each other, there would only be one of us here. Right? There are billions of us here, and part of our lives is to learn to work together in healthy ways. We have valid human needs for love and connection. But when these wounded parts of us, when we learn how to meet the needs of these wounded parts of us, without seeking outside of ourselves for those needs to get met, we choose healthier methods of seeking those basic, authentic human needs for love and connection. And this isn't really that complicated, but what it requires is some presence. It requires some attentiveness. It requires being in tune with our emotional reality. What happens for most of us is a wound gets triggered and we react. We feel desperate. We start chasing people. We start acting out. We start guarding ourselves. We start walling up. Our communication dies. We start being passive aggressive. We start being judgmental. We start being critical. We cut people out of our lives without really having an authentic conversation with them. We pine over people. We beg, right? These are all different kinds of trauma responses. The 4 basic trauma responses are fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, right? So everything I've just been saying are like variations of those. And so as we can recognize, maybe just to give a common example, I'm dating someone, I send them a text, they don't text back right away. And now I'm in my mind going, are they going to ghost me? Do they like me? Did I say something wrong? Am I not attractive enough? Am I not good enough? Did I make a mistake? Am I not lovable? And we start to feel that anxiety and we start to feel that discomfort in our bodies. What we need to cultivate is a presence of mind and a presence of being where we can look at what is happening there and we can say, oh, I see. This is not me, my adult self in my life today that's talking right now. This is a childhood version of me from a long time ago that feels unwanted and insecure and unsafe. And in that moment, we can be to ourselves the parent that childhood part of us needs. When we can start to catch the wounds before they trigger a reaction, we can start to meet the needs where they need to be met before they trigger some kind of intense reaction, before we start acting out in some way. This is how we move from our need to be chosen to being in a place where we can actually choose conscious love. I'm no longer chasing anyone at this point. I'm no longer trying to prove myself to anyone. I'm no longer pining over anyone. Because whatever is happening inside of me that would make me want to do that, I'm able to tend to that on my own. And so now when I look out into my love life or in my relationships to meet those fundamental human needs of love and connection, I am doing it from a place where I am consciously choosing the kinds of relationships that I want to have. And it gets to the point where people need to start earning their relationship with me rather than me always trying to get them to pick me. I just want to say thank you so much for being with me today. It's always a pleasure to be here and connect and share. I hope you found this message powerful, and I hope that it makes a positive difference in your life. Big love and blessings, and I'll see you back here next week on the Conscious Love Show. Take care, everybody. Bye. Thanks again for checking out the show. Please subscribe on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on the most. And I would love it so much if you'd leave a review and tell people what you think of us. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram @TheLivingRelationship to connect more closely. and I'm grateful to be supporting you on your journey to love.